I was born where the hive's light failed. Not metaphorically, though it would come to mean that as well, but literally. In a stratum so low the lumen globes flickered like dying insects and were left unrepaired for months at a time. Light was rationed down there the way everything else was. In brief allowances, in unreliable bursts, in quantities just sufficient to remind you what you were missing. My first memories are not of faces. They are of ceilings, low, sweating ceilings threaded with pipes that groaned and wept a constant brownish condensation. Drops fell with patient regularity, tapping against rusted decking and exposed skin alike. We learned to sleep between the drips, timing our breaths to the rhythm of decay. The air tasted of metal and mold and old incense. Someone somewhere above us still burned devotional candles, and their smoke filtered downward through cracked ducting and forgotten vents. By the time it reached us, it smelled less like prayer and more like a corpse left too long in a shrine. They told me later that I had a mother. I do not remember her face, only the sound of her coughing in the dark and the way her hands shook when she tried to portion food. Ration bars came stamped with dates older than I was, and she would scrape the mold away with a chipped blade, whispering apologies as if the food itself could hear her. When she died, and she did quietly. One night between shifts, I learned my first true lesson of the hive. No one stops working because you are gone. Her body was wrapped in industrial cloth and taken upward on a cart with 3 others. I watched from a doorway while an administratum servitor scanned her corpse, beeped once, and stamped a slate with a code that was not her name. I asked a man nearby what would happen to her. Rendered, he said, without looking at me. Eventually. That was the first time I understood that death was not an ending. It was a process. Violence came earlier than words. Before I could read the warnings stenciled on the walls, I could recognize the sound of gunfire echoing through the corridors, sharp, concussive cracks that sent flocks of sumprats scattering. Screams followed gunfire with enough regularity that they blurred together in memory. A single drawn-out note of suffering that underpinned every day. The walls were covered in saints. Not whole saints, never whole. Rusted icons nailed crookedly into cracked plascrete, their faces eaten away by corrosion, their hands missing fingers. Someone had scrawled prayers beneath them in faded ink and dried blood, each plea overlapping the last. I would trace the letters when I was small, trying to guess which god listened to which script. None of them ever answered. Names were temporary down there. You earned one, lost it, earned another. Sometimes you took the name of someone stronger after they died, wearing it like a coat that was still warm. Other times, you were known only by what you could do, runner, cutter, lookout. I went through 3 names before I was 10, and none of them mattered enough to remember. Food was the real currency. Food, and the ability to keep it. The hive taught us that early. Survival belonged to those who could enforce it with their fists. Or knives. Or scavenged shock sticks that sparked unpredictably and burned more often than they stunned. Mercy was spoken of the way upper hive folk spoke of luxury goods. Nice, in theory, but utterly impractical. If you shared, you starved later. If you hesitated, you bled now. I learned how to hit before I learned how to count. Learned where to strike so a bigger opponent would drop. Learned how to curl into myself when blows came back. Pain was not something to be avoided. It was something to be managed, rationed like air. The first time I broke someone's arm, I was 8. He was older, faster, and hungry in a way that made him reckless. He cornered me near a refuse chute, teeth bared, eyes fixed on the satchel at my hip. I remember thinking, not panicking, not praying, just calculating. The way his weight shifted when he lunged. The exposed joint when he reached. The sound it made still visits me in my sleep. A wet, snapping crunch, followed by a scream that echoed down the chute and came back to us distorted and doubled. I ran, clutching my food. Heart hammering not with fear, but with something colder. Satisfaction. That was when I realized something important. The hive did not care what you did, only whether you survived doing it. By the time I reached adolescence, if that word still applies where I was born, I understood that I was already guilty simply for existing. The walls told me so, plastered with warning signs and purity edicts. The Vox announcements told me so, crackling reminders that compliance was mandatory and deviation punishable. Even the saints, rusted and blind, seemed to accuse me with their ruined gazes. Guilt was ambient, like radiation. You absorbed it without noticing until it was too late. Sometimes Arbite's patrols came down into the lower levels. Not often, they preferred to let us police ourselves, but when they did, they came in armored columns. Boots striking sparks from the decking. Their visors were opaque, their weapons clean. They never spoke to us directly. Orders were barked through amplifiers, distorted into something mechanical and absolute. We would scatter, flatten ourselves against walls, become debris. Anyone too slow learned another lesson. Law was not about justice. It was about demonstration. I watched a man get beaten unconscious for failing to present identification he did not possess. Watched a woman dragged away screaming because her work chit was expired by 2 days. The arbitrators never looked at their faces. Why would they? Faces were interchangeable down here. Afterward, we would gather in the shadows and whisper about it. Not in outrage, never that, but in analysis. Where they came from. How long they stayed. What they took. Information was another currency, and like all currencies, it favored those who hoarded it. At night, I dreamed of climbing. Not to the spires. No one down there believed in miracles, but just high enough to breathe cleaner air. High enough that the pipes didn't drip. High enough that the saints were painted, not rusted. When I woke, the dream tasted bitter, like something stolen. The hive itself was never quiet. Even in the deepest hours of the shift cycle, there was always the hum of machinery, the distant clang of industry, the endless, patient grinding of a city that had been working since before my ancestors learned to speak. Sometimes alarms wailed far above us, their meaning lost by the time they reached our level. Other times, we felt tremors as entire sections were sealed or purged, and we would count ourselves lucky if the air kept flowing. I learned to read the hive the way others read scripture. A change in vibration meant a lift shaft failure. A certain pitch of siren meant a labor dispute being corrected. The smell of promethium meant fire, or something worse being cleaned with fire. We were not ignorant. We were informed in ways that mattered. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when I felt something like kindness. A stranger pushing me out of the way of falling debris. An older woman pressing a ration chit into my hand and telling me to run. Those moments were dangerous. They tempted you to believe in something other than the arithmetic of survival. I paid for that temptation once. A boy my age, thin as wire, with eyes too large for his face. We ran together for a while, shared scraps, watched each other's backs. He talked about leaving the lower levels someday. About finding honest work in the manufacturum tiers. He believed in progress the way some people believed in saints. When the gang came, though we didn't call them that yet, not formally, they took him first. He resisted. I watched from behind a vent grate as they beat him until he stopped moving. I could have shouted, could have thrown something, could have done anything. I did nothing. Later, one of them found me, looked me up and down, assessed my size, my scars, the way I held myself. "You want to eat?" he asked. I nodded. That was how it started. Not with ideology, not with loyalty, but with hunger. The hive had taught me all the prerequisites already. How to obey without question, how to hurt without hesitation, how to live with the weight of guilt as a constant companion. All that remained was for someone to formalize it, to give my violence a direction and call it purpose. As I lay in the dark that night, listening to the pipes drip and the saints rust, I understood something with terrible clarity. There was no innocence left to lose. Whatever I became, the hive had already decided I deserved it. I slept, and dreamed not of climbing, but of surviving another day. That was enough. They did not recruit me so much as absorb me. There was no ceremony to it, no oath spoken aloud. I was brought through corridors I had avoided my whole life, territory marked by layered sigils and threat glyphs. Warnings carved deep enough that even corrosion hadn't erased them. The walls grew narrower, the ceilings lower, as if the hive itself leaned in to listen. We met in a chamber that had once been a shrine. You could tell by the alcoves, by the cracked plinth where a statue had stood before it was stripped for scrap. The saints were still there, or parts of them were, faces hammered flat, hands missing. Icons defaced and overwritten with gang marks. Faith repurposed, not destroyed. Nothing was ever wasted. I remember the smell most of all. Burnt flesh, old oil, and chemical antiseptic that failed to mask either. A brazier burned in the center of the room, fed by something thicker than wood. The flames sputtered and hissed, casting shadows that crawled across the walls like living things. They didn't ask my name. One of them, taller than the rest, wrapped in layered leathers reinforced with scrap plating, gestured for me to kneel. His voice came through a crude Vox grill mounted at his throat, distorted and buzzing, as if he no longer trusted his own lungs. "Hold still," he said. Not a threat. A statement. Someone grabbed my arm from behind, wrenching it forward. I didn't struggle. Struggling would have marked me as weak. The brazier was dragged closer, and I saw the brand heating within it. A jagged sigil, asymmetrical. Designed not for beauty, but for permanence. The metal glowed dull red, then brighter, until the air around it shimmered. For a moment, I thought of my mother's hands shaking as she scraped mold from ration bars. Then the brand touched my flesh. Pain like that does not scream. It roars inward. It collapses the world down to a single point, a blinding, white-hot certainty that obliterates thought. I bit down hard enough that I tasted blood, felt my teeth grind, felt something crack. They held me there longer than necessary. That was the point. When it was done, they let me fall. I lay on the cold deck plating. Arm smoking, vision swimming. Someone poured something caustic onto the wound. It burned almost as badly as the brand itself, sealing flesh and smell together. I did not cry out. I would not give them that. "Up," the tall one said eventually. "You eat with us now." And I did. Food tastes different when it is earned through pain. Greasier. Heavier. I devoured it without savoring, hands shaking, arm throbbing in time with my pulse. Around me, the others watched with open calculation. Not curiosity. Not welcome. Assessment. From that day on, orders came down from men I never saw. Sometimes it was a voice crackling through a wall-mounted Vox unit, warped by static and interference. Sometimes it was a runner delivering a slate stamped with symbols I could barely read. Sometimes it was just a look from someone higher up the chain. A nod that meant go, a shake that meant wait. I never saw the top. None of us did. Authority was distant by design, filtered through layers of intermediaries and fear. If something went wrong, blame flowed downward. If something went right, credit vanished upward. We enforced debts measured in ration chits and human teeth. Chits were straightforward. Missed payments meant broken fingers, confiscated goods. Sometimes the loss of a living space. Teeth were different. Teeth were symbolic. A message. The Hive understood symbols better than laws. I learned how to extract them cleanly. A sharp twist, a practiced angle. The sound, another wet crunch, became familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. People begged. They always begged. In a dozen dialects. With 1,000 excuses. Sick children. Missed shifts. Faulty equipment. None of it mattered. Fear bends people faster than pain. That was one of the first lessons drilled into us. Pain was immediate, but fear lingered. Fear spread. A man beaten would heal. A man humiliated, marked, made an example of, he would warn others for you. Each job hollowed me out a little more. I could feel it happening, like erosion. At first, I justified it. Told myself these people would have done the same to me if given the chance. Told myself the gang fed me, protected me, gave me purpose. They called it loyalty. Loyalty meant obedience. Obedience meant survival. Freedom was a word we used often, usually while laughing. Freedom from the arbitrators. Freedom from starvation. Freedom to take what we needed. I repeated it to myself like a prayer, especially when the work turned ugly. The walls did close tighter. As the gang expanded, so did its demands. Territory had to be maintained. Rivals discouraged. Informants silenced. I was sent deeper into places even the desperate avoided. Collapsed habs crawling with some vermin, maintenance tunnels where the air burned your lungs. Forgotten sectors sealed by the administratum and quietly reopened by those who knew how. I learned to read people the way I read the Hive. The way their eyes darted. The way their shoulders tensed. The subtle shift before a lie. It made the work easier. It made me more efficient. Efficiency was praised. Sometimes after a job, I would catch my reflection in a scrap of polished metal or a stagnant pool. The brand on my arm had healed into a raised, ugly scar, its lines unmistakable. My eyes looked older than they should have been. Harder. As if something inside had already calcified. Sleep became difficult. When I closed my eyes, I saw faces, not clearly. Not individually, but as a mass of accusation. I drank recycled Amasec to dull it, chewed stim leaf until my gums bled. The gang encouraged it. A dulled enforcer was a compliant one. There were rules, of course. Not written, but absolute. Never steal from the gang. Never question an order. Never show weakness in front of outsiders. Punishments were swift and instructional, designed to be witnessed. I saw a man flayed for skimming chits. Watched another have his tongue removed for speaking out of turn. We were made to stand there, to watch, to learn. The lesson was always the same. The gang was mercy compared to what lay beyond. I believed that for a time. Then came the job that taught me how thin that mercy was. A debtor holed up with his family in a half-collapsed hab, barricaded behind scrap and prayer strips. He had missed 3 payments. Orders were clear: collect or make an example. When we breached the door, the air inside was thick with incense and fear. The man fell to his knees immediately, pressing his forehead to the floor, babbling apologies. His wife clutched a child to her chest. The child couldn't have been more than a few years old, eyes wide, silent. I felt something twist in my gut. Not pity. Recognition. For a fraction of a second, a sliver of time so small it should not have mattered, I hesitated. It did not save them. It did not change the outcome. But it was noticed. Later, one of the higher enforcers pulled me aside. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten me. He simply said, "Don't do that again." That was worse. From then on, I buried whatever that hesitation had been. Pushed it down until it went quiet. I told myself it was weakness. A liability. Something the Hive had no patience for. The gang fed me. The gang armed me. The gang named me. But every night, as I lay in some borrowed corner of the Hive, listening to the distant machinery grind and the saints rust in silence, I felt the walls pressing closer. Not physically, though that too, but inside my chest. I told myself this was freedom. The Hive taught me better. Failure, I learned, is not an event. It is a deviation. A momentary misalignment between what is demanded and what is delivered. The Hive does not rage at deviation. It corrects it, patiently and publicly, the way a machine compensates for drift. My deviation was small, almost theoretical. A debtor. Mid-level hab stack. Nothing special. The kind of job that barely registered, handed down through Vox static and half-corrupted slates. Missed quotas, unpaid chits. Unauthorized siphoning of power from a manufacturum line. The charges blurred together. They always did. Guilt was assumed. The paperwork merely justified the timing. We breached at shift change, when the corridors were loud enough to mask the sound of boots. The door came apart under a ram fashioned from repurposed machinery, metal screaming as it tore free. Inside, the hab was narrow and low-ceilinged, walls lined with insulation foam yellowed by age. A shrine flickered in the corner, candles guttering beneath a soot-blackened icon. The man was older than most. Thin, spine bent by decades of labor. His hands were scarred in the way only long factory shifts can scar them. Burns layered over cuts, skin thickened and cracked. When he looked up at us, his eyes widened. Not in surprise, but in resignation. He spoke before we could. Not in the common tongue, but in a dialect I hadn't heard since childhood. The cadence was wrong for this level. The vowels stretched and softened in a way that pulled at something buried deep in me. It was the way my mother had spoken when she was tired, when she was afraid. He begged. Not loudly, not theatrically. Just words spilling out, explanations tangled with apologies. He talked about quotas raised without notice, about a machine that had taken 2 fingers and left him slower, about a supervisor who had marked him down anyway. He talked about his family, about a daughter who coughed at night, about faith and service and the Emperor's mercy. My squad spread out, practiced, efficient. One covered the rear. Another scanned the hab for valuables. The leader looked at me, visor reflecting my own face back at me in warped fragments. "Do it," he said. I raised my weapon, and hesitated. It was nothing. A breath. A fraction of a second where my finger did not tighten on the trigger. Where my eyes met the man's. And instead of seeing a debtor, I saw a future I had narrowly avoided. That was enough. The leader noticed. Of course he did. He had been doing this longer than I had been alive. His head tilted slightly, a gesture so small it could have been accidental. The job proceeded. Another enforcer stepped forward, struck the man down with the butt of his weapon, silencing the dialect mid-syllable. We left with what we came for. Chits, tools, teeth. The shrine was overturned on the way out, candles crushed under boots. Standard procedure. No one spoke to me about it on the return. That was the second warning. The punishment came 3 cycles later. They took me at the end of a meal, when my guard was down and my hands were occupied. 2 of them seized my arms, hauling me to my feet. I did not resist. Resistance would have escalated things, and escalation was never in the victim's favor. We moved through corridors I recognized only vaguely, deeper into territory controlled entirely by the gang. The walls here were cleaner, better maintained. Not because of care, but because appearances mattered at this level of power. Vox lines ran exposed along the ceilings, humming softly with traffic from unseen sources. The chamber they brought me to was larger than most, a converted transit hub sealed off from public use. The floor sloped downward toward a central platform, stained dark by old fluids. Lumen strips cast harsh white light that left no shadows to hide in. They were already there. Most of the gang, arrayed in a loose semicircle. Faces familiar, some indifferent, some curious. A few avoided my gaze. That hurt more than the rest. At the center stood the one I had never seen up close before. The voice behind the static. The authority behind the intermediaries. He was not impressive in the way I had imagined. No towering armor, no ornate weapons. Just a man wrapped in layered coats, his face partially obscured by a rebreather unit that hissed softly with each breath. His eyes, visible through clear lenses, were sharp and utterly unkind. "Step forward," he said. I did. They stripped me to the waist. The air was cold against my skin, raising gooseflesh around the scar of the brand. I felt exposed in a way that went beyond nudity. This was not about flesh. It was about visibility. "Explain," he said. There was a right answer. I knew that. The right answer was silence, or a confession framed as self-criticism. Weakness acknowledged and rejected. I opened my mouth and said nothing. That too was a failure. He nodded once. The shock malls came down. The first strike stole my breath. Electricity surged through muscle and nerve, locking my body in place, forcing a scream from my throat I could not contain. The second strike followed immediately, then the third. Each impact a lesson delivered with mechanical precision. They laughed. Not all of them, but enough. I lost track of time. Pain does that. Stretches moments into eternities and compresses minutes into nothing. I remember the smell of my own flesh, the way my muscles spasmed uncontrollably, the way my vision tunneled until all I could see was the stained floor beneath me. When I collapsed, they hauled me back up. Again, the leader said. This was not about what I had done. It was about what I represented. Hesitation was contagious. Mercy was a virus. They were burning it out of me in front of witnesses. By the end, I could no longer scream. My throat was raw, my voice reduced to a wet rasp. My body shook with aftershocks, nerves firing uselessly. When they finally released me, I hit the floor hard enough to crack a tooth. "Learn," the leader said and turned away. They left me there for a while. Long enough for the lesson to settle. Long enough for the others to file past me on their way out, boots thudding, eyes averted or cold. When someone finally dragged me to a corner and dumped a canteen beside me, it was done without ceremony. Recovery was slow. Painkillers were rationed. And I was not a priority. Every movement sent lightning through my limbs. Sleep came in fragments, broken by memories of laughter and the hum of the malls. But worse than the pain was what came after. The silence. Something inside me went quiet after that day. Not all at once, not dramatically. More like a machine winding down, one function at a time. The part of me that flinched at pleading voices. The part that remembered dialects and hands scraping mold from ration bars. It scared me. Pain I understood. Pain was honest. Pain meant you were still engaged with the world. This was different. This was absence. A hollowing out that left room for something colder to take its place. When I returned to work, I followed orders without thought. That was the real correction. I did not hesitate again. When someone begged, I did not hear words, only noise. When a job went bad, I adapted without panic. My efficiency improved. My reports were cleaner. I was praised quietly, indirectly. The screams blurred into background noise. Sometimes, in the middle of an act, hand on a throat, weapon raised, I would feel a distant echo of fear. Not for the person in front of me, but for myself. For how easily I did these things now. For how natural it felt. I told myself this was strength. That the Hive rewarded strength. That survival demanded it. At night, when sleep finally came, I dreamed less. When I did dream, it was not of faces, but of corridors stretching endlessly downward, walls closing in, air growing thin. I would wake gasping, heart racing, then calm myself with the knowledge that I was still useful. Usefulness was safety. The gang noticed the change. They trusted me more, gave me harder assignments, ones that required reliability above all else. I became a tool they could depend on, honed by punishment and fear. I no longer thought about leaving. The idea felt abstract, like a story told to children. There was only the work, the next order, the next demonstration. Whatever I had been before that hesitation died on the floor of that chamber. Whatever remained stood up, wiped the blood from its mouth, and went back to enforcing the Hive's will. And the silence stayed with me, a constant companion. They sent me deeper after that. Not downward in elevation, there were always deeper levels, but inward, into the manufacturing warrens where the Hive's real work was done. The places that did not sleep. The places that fed the rest of the city with stamped metal, refined chemicals, and bodies worn down to compliance. The transition was framed as a promotion. A badge, crudely cast but officially stamped. A sidearm with a serial number that almost matched its paperwork. Slates bearing my designation, my authority expanded and codified. I was no longer just muscle. I was an enforcer with jurisdiction. My brutality now sanctioned by overlapping layers of gang influence and imperial neglect. The warrens smelled different. Not of rot and incense, but of heat and chemicals and burnt metal. The air was thick enough to chew, each breath coating the inside of my lungs with residue. Fine metallic dust settled on skin and gear, working its way into seams and pores. By the end of a shift, my sweat ran gray. The workers lived chained to their labor. Not literally. Chains were inefficient, but by quotas, by threat of sanction, by the ever-present overseers whose eyes never seemed to blink. Habstacks were built directly into the manufacturing walls, stacked like storage crates. People slept within arm's reach of the machines that would wake them. Shifts blurred together. 12 hours, 14, sometimes more if a deadline loomed. The machines did not care. The administratum did not care. And when people broke, when they slowed or protested or dared to imagine rest, it fell to me to remind them of their place. Strikes rarely announced themselves. They began as whispers, as pauses a fraction of a second too long, as tools set down and not immediately picked up again. Hope was subtle that way, cautious, like a wounded animal testing the air. We crushed it early. A show of force at the first sign of deviation. Enforcers in formation, weapons visible. Boots striking the deck in unison. Overseers stood behind us, data slates in hand, recording output fluctuations and compliance metrics. Everything was measured. Everything was documented. I learned to break strikes before they began. You didn't need to kill anyone. Not usually. You just needed to identify the instigators. The ones whose eyes still held something like belief. Remove them. Publicly if possible. A beating administered in front of peers did more than any speech ever could. Hope, once humiliated, spread less readily. The workers' faces haunted me at first. Not individually, but as a collective. The hollow cheeks, the chemical burns. The augmetic limbs installed not for improvement, but for replacement. I saw how close our lives were to theirs, separated only by a badge and a gun. I understood then that I was disposable too. Just better fed. The overseers treated me with a thin veneer of respect. They used titles, acknowledged my presence, offered recaf laced with stimulants that left a bitter aftertaste. But I saw the way they looked at me when they thought I wasn't watching. The same way they looked at malfunctioning equipment. Useful, but replaceable. Efficiency was all that mattered. They recorded my actions with cold precision. Time to compliance. Resources expended. Damage incurred. Every intervention reduced to numbers on a slate. I began to think of myself that way too. My worth quantified in how quickly I could restore order. The noise was constant. Machinery screamed and clanged, pistons hammering, conveyors rattling. Vox announcements barked out production targets and purity reminders, their voices distorted by age and neglect. Alarms wailed at irregular intervals, each one meaning something different, each one demanding immediate response. At first, it overwhelmed me. Then it faded into a dull roar, a background against which violence stood out in sharp relief. There were moments, rare, dangerous moments, when I caught myself envying the workers. They had an endpoint, however distant. A quota met. A shift ended. A collapse that at least promised unconsciousness. My work had no such boundaries. There was always another disturbance. Another correction to be made. I was sent into the hab warrens attached to the manufacturums, places even more cramped than the lower hive. their walls vibrating constantly with the thrum of production. Children played in corridors slick with lubricant runoff. Elders coughed themselves to sleep beneath vents that leaked warm, chemical-laced air. When riots broke out, they were chaotic, desperate affairs. Not organized revolutions, but explosions of accumulated suffering. People armed with tools and scrap, faces twisted with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. We answered with discipline. I remember one riot in particular. It began over a reduction in water rations, announced without warning. The workers downed tools, surged into the main transit corridor, chanting slogans half-remembered from old catechisms. For a moment, a terrible, intoxicating moment, it looked like they might overwhelm the overseers. Then we arrived. We formed a line, weapons raised, visors down. The chanting faltered. Some fell back. Others surged forward, driven by desperation or belief or both. I gave the order to advance. Batons cracked. Shockmalls flared. Bodies hit the deck. The corridor filled with screams and the sharp smell of ozone. It ended quickly, as these things always did. Order restored. Output resumed. Afterward, an overseer clapped me on the shoulder and told me my efficiency rating had improved. I did not feel pride. I felt empty. The air in the warrens did something to my lungs. A constant ache, a tightness that never fully eased. Medicaid dispensers issued inhalants that tasted of mint and metal. A temporary relief that came with a warning about dependency. I took them anyway. At night, when I returned to whatever corner of the hive I was assigned, I stripped off my gear and watched gray dust fall from it in small piles. I scrubbed my skin raw, but the smell of chemicals lingered, embedded deeper than flesh. Sometimes I dreamed of the workers' faces merging into one, a single, accusing mass. Other times, I dreamed of machines, endless and indifferent, their pistons rising and falling like the breathing of a god. I began to understand the hive not as a place, but as a system, a vast, self-correcting mechanism that consumed lives to maintain equilibrium. I was a component now, slotted into place, my function clearly defined. When components failed, they were replaced. That knowledge sat heavy in my chest. Not fear, fear had dulled, but something like inevitability. I knew, with a certainty that left no room for hope, that my usefulness had a limit. That one day, I would be the deviation corrected. Until then, I enforced. I crushed hope beneath my boots. Recorded by overseers who would never remember my name. I breathed air that burned and drank stimulants that ate at my nerves. I told myself that this was survival, that this was purpose. The hive taught me the truth. There is no purpose, only function. Wars in the hive do not begin with declarations. They begin with shortages, with rumors, with small, deniable acts of sabotage that administrators mislabel as inefficiencies and gangs recognize as challenges. A shipment goes missing. A patrol fails to report. A corridor changes hands without paperwork ever acknowledging it did. By the time the fighting started in earnest, it had already been going on for weeks. The rival gang pushed upward from the lower levels like a rising infection, testing boundaries, probing weak points. They wore different sigils, marked their territory with different glyphs, but they were born of the same rot. I recognized their tactics because they mirrored our own. Ambushes in narrow corridors, booby-trapped access points, informants silenced before they could be useful. Orders came fast, and they contradicted each other. Hold this sector. Fall back from that one. Advance without support. Secure an area already lost. Vox channels overlapped, commands garbled by static and interference. Authority fractured under pressure. And confusion became a weapon deadlier than bullets. We fought in corridors slick with blood and promethium. The floors were treacherous, coated in a mixture of spilled fuel and bodily fluids that made every step uncertain. Lumen globes shattered early. Plunging sections into strobing darkness lit only by muzzle flashes and emergency strips. The air filled with smoke and the sharp, choking tang of burned propellant. I killed men whose stories mirrored my own. I saw it in the way they moved, the way they hugged cover, the way they flinched at certain sounds. These were not fanatics or monsters. They were survivors, hardened by the same lessons, shaped by the same hive. If circumstances had shifted slightly, if a corridor had collapsed differently, I might have worn their colors. There was no time to dwell on that. Combat in the hive is intimate. Distances are short. You see the whites of eyes, the sweat, the fear. You hear breath hitch and bones crack. There is no abstraction, no comforting distance. Every kill is personal, whether you want it to be or not. We advanced through a hab block taken and retaken so many times that ownership became meaningless. Bodies lay where they fell, too numerous to move, trampled into the decking. The dead were stripped quickly, ammo, chits, anything useful by both sides. Even in war, efficiency mattered. At one junction, we ran into an ambush. They came at us from above and behind, charges detonating in the confined space. The blast wave slamming me into a wall hard enough to drive the breath from my lungs. My ears rang, a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. When my vision cleared, the corridor was chaos. Smoke, shouting, blood spraying in arterial arcs. I fired until my weapon clicked empty, reloaded by muscle memory, fired again. Someone went down at my feet, clutching at my leg, eyes wide with something like recognition. I kicked him away without thinking and kept moving. Later, I realized he had been one of ours. There was no time to check. No time to mourn. Hesitation got you killed. We lost ground, regained it, lost it again. The hive shook with distant detonations as whole sections were sealed or vented to deny access. Emergency klaxons wailed, their coded chants announcing lockdowns and casualty thresholds breached. The machine voice recited numbers without emotion. Casualties were tallied in real time. When the fighting finally slowed, when one side withdrew not because it was beaten, but because it had achieved whatever objective it had never bothered to articulate, we took stock. The dead were counted as acceptable losses. That was the phrase used. Acceptable. As if loss were a resource to be allocated, not a wound to be felt. Slates were updated. Rosters amended. Vacancies noted for future recruitment. Some of my closest comrades were among the acceptable. A man who had pulled me out from under falling debris years earlier, his laughter loud and contagious even in the worst conditions. A woman who had shared contraband recaf with me during long shifts, who swore she would make it to the upper manufactorum someday. Their bodies lay cooling in the corridors, already beginning the slow process of reclamation by scavengers and servitors. No rites were observed. No names spoken. I stood among the wreckage, my weapon hanging heavy in my hands, and felt something settle in me like a disease. Not grief. Grief required a softness I no longer possessed, but guilt, thick and pervasive. Survivor's guilt, they might have called it in some forgotten manual. The guilt of being spared without reason. Why me? The hive offered no answer. In the aftermath, order was declared restored. Patrols were reestablished. Territory lines redrawn on internal maps that would never be seen by those who lived and died within them. We were issued commendations for our service and warnings about resource expenditure. Ammunition costs exceeded projections. Rations would be adjusted accordingly. I laughed when I heard that. A short, sharp sound that surprised even me. It earned me a look from an overseer, cold and assessing. I stopped. That night, I cleaned my weapon by habit, hands moving automatically. Dried blood flaked off in dark scales. I found a notch in the casing where a round had nearly breached. Close enough that I could imagine how easily it might have gone the other way. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it was filled with corridors that never ended, with faces I could not distinguish, with the sound of alarms chanting my name in a language I did not understand. I woke drenched in sweat, lungs burning, heart racing. I had survived. The hive had taken note, not with gratitude, but with calculation. I was still useful, still operational, still alive. For now, the guilt did not fade. It embedded itself, a constant ache beneath the surface, flaring at unexpected moments. I carried it with me into every subsequent action, a reminder that survival was not a virtue, merely an outcome. The war ended, as all hive wars do, not with victory, but with exhaustion. The rival gang retreated, weakened but not destroyed. We consolidated, licked our wounds, prepared for the next cycle of violence. I stood on a gantry overlooking a sealed corridor, watching servitors drag bodies toward reclamation chutes. The machine voice announced corrected statistics, losses adjusted, projections updated. The dead were numbers now. I was not. That distinction felt temporary.